So today we're just delighted to have Jessica Metcalf here from Princeton. Jessica is, I guess she probably used to call herself a biologist, but now calls herself probably a biodemographer, at least in one of her hats. So that's why we're delighted to have her here. I first met Jessica when she was doing a postdoc after getting her PhD. One of her postdocs was at Max Planck, and now she is one of the first assistant professor appointments ever at Princeton in the Office of Population Research and in biology. So we're just delighted to have you here. One of her interests is on infectious diseases, but another very interesting topic she works on is the biodemography of plants, and she lists as her interest the question, how long do trees live, how fast do they grow, and what does this imply for rates of carbon turnover and recovery following the spread of forest pathogens? So the connection of biodemography and global warming is also another area that she's working on. So today we're here to hear about epidemics and infections and the connection to demography. So thank you, Jessica.
Thank you. So my voice doesn't carry at all, so shout at me if you can't hear me. So I've always identified as a demographer. In fact, my PhD was on demography of plants. And it's a real pleasure to be in one of the departments that also identifies as a demographer, one of the rare ones. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about human demography and childhood infections. I'm going to start by just going through the general principles. I'll talk about the consequences of changing births in this context. I'll talk about changing mobility and how we might expect that to shape some of the childhood infections I'm interested in. And finally, I'll just discuss disease and motion really quickly. And some of the exciting directions I'm interested in at the moment. Well, I find them exciting. So a lot of my work at the moment is concerned with measles and rubella. These are directly transmitted pathogens, so you can only get them from someone else who has measles or rubella. They're completely immunizing. So once you've had them, you'll never have them again. And humans are their only hosts. So there's no monkey out there that gets measles or rubella. There's no reservoir in the soil or on tables. You really have to meet someone with measles or rubella to get measles or rubella. And this means that from the point of view of the pathogen, all that matters is our demography. And from the point of view of the pathogen, each of us is either susceptible, infected, or recovered. So susceptible means that they can infect you, infected means they are infecting people, and recovered means you're essentially dead if you're recovered, because they can't infect you anymore. And this really simple schedule, obviously, this really simple life cycle, lends itself to we have an exquisite understanding of what we'd expect for the dynamics of these pathogens. And a classic tool in this context is something called an SIR model, susceptible, infected, recovered model. And so just here now, first considering a closed population, if you imagine you're in a population where just about everybody is susceptible, and you bring in an infected individual with an R0 of 5. So in the context of infectious diseases, the R0 is used to define the number of new infections per one infectious individual in a completely susceptible population. Right? So if I had rubella and we were to hang out for 3 weeks and you're all susceptible, on average I get 5 of you sick. If it was measles, I get 20 of you sick. So this is an example where this is an infected individual brought into this population, and we know exactly what's going to happen. The susceptibles are depleted, the recovereds increase, and the infection increases and then turns over. And every detail of this is beautifully described by very simple mathematical equations. So, of course, that's a very simple schedule. That's not how reality works. It's very far from reality. And one of the ways in which it's far from reality is, in fact, populations are replenished, populations aren't closed. New births are occurring, and that's replenishing the pool of susceptible individuals. And these are also being depleted by vaccination for most of these infections in most of the populations we might think about. Right? So, and then there's, of course, the really intriguing thing about these pathogens is that their dynamics depend on our behavior, because we have to be aggregating for them to spread. And I think one of the really compelling things about this is if you're somebody who's interested in data and theory, their dynamics are driven by incredibly strong feedbacks. So one new infected individual both increases spread but also reduces spread by removing susceptibles. So there's these really strong feedbacks shaping the dynamics. You can, of course, lay down equations if that's what you like. This is describing flow through these compartments, susceptible, infected, recovered. Again, susceptible, infected, recovered models are the bedrock of this field. And you have individuals being born and dying. We're going at equilibrium here. Being vaccinated, susceptibles are depleted by transmission. So an infected meets a susceptible with some transmission potential and end up in this compartment and then filter down to this one. Really simple framework, extremely tractable mathematically, of course. We can get at the equilibria, and now this is no longer, the infection isn't turning over and going to zero because the susceptibles are being replenished. So we have an equilibrial number of infecteds that is higher than zero, and susceptibles we can work out as well. We can also work out the average age of infection, and this is something I'm going to come back to. And essentially that's simply defined as the inverse of the rate at which susceptibles are becoming infected. So if you know something about your pathogen, you know a lot about what it's going to look like in the world, which is quite cool. And here's data from London, 1944 to 1994. The black lines are the data, right? And the red points are a model prediction. So you can get a long way with a really strong feedback. The way the model works is we know what birth rates look like over this period. And we can estimate transmission, and the piece I haven't told you about is there's almost always seasonal fluctuations in transmission, but we can back that out because we know what the pattern of births was, and we have data on the numbers of infectors. And then we kick forwards just with a deterministic simulation with some parameters describing starting proportion susceptible, transmission over the course of a year, and we get this lovely match.
So it's all driven by birth rate?
So the timing of the peaks, you can actually, so a lot of it's driven by birth rate. So you get this annual phase right after the war, which was driven by the baby boom, because as soon as the birth rates drop, you just don't have enough susceptibles to have another outbreak in the years immediately following a large outbreak. So you move into biennial dynamics. And this is a pattern that you see sort of in multiple contexts across the states and everything. But I have a postdoc who just did a lovely bit of work because we have equivalent data from America, which has recently been digitized, a wonderful exercise out of the University of Pitt. And he showed that just by slightly tweaking the shape of the seasonal transmission function, it looks like in America school holidays were a little bit longer, like summer holiday, and you get essentially deterministic chaos. So Los Angeles has like wacky 3-year and then nothing, it's just all over the shop. So it is mostly driven by birth rates, but the seasonal cycle also has a part to play. I think it's quite, go on.
Does the speed of does treatment matter? And does treatment change over time to affect how long someone is sort of infectious rather than recovered?
That's a great question. And what I didn't mention is, of course, we started vaccinating right here.
Right. So distinct from vaccination.
But there isn't really treatment distinct from vaccination. This is something that happens really fast, right? So the generation time of measles seems to be about 2 weeks. So from me being infected to the next lot being infected is about 2 weeks. So intervening, you just have to be so quick. That's not to say that human behavior can't change outcomes. There was a big outbreak in an Amish group in Ohio last year. And you saw that the moment it happened, they stopped the wedding season and they stayed in their houses. Yeah, and the outbreak turned over. And they didn't really like vaccinations, so that wasn't happening. So really what was shaping those dynamics was the human behavior.
So treatment is essentially changes to social behavior rather than some medical intervention.
Exactly. I guess my brain went that way just because I was imagining ways in which. But there isn't palliative care if you were to. Yeah. Anyway, I'll keep moving.
But the prediction here is the kind of the one-step prediction, or you start with the initial prediction in 1944 and you get the whole thing.
And you get the whole thing.
And it says that 1962 will be bigger than 1959.
Yeah. And obviously I think you can, if you tweak the starting conditions, you can get out of phase for this part, right? So you might be predicting the big year in the year before or after. But it just so happens this one seems rock steady. However you do it, you end up with sensible predictions. Ron doesn't believe it. I'll keep going. I will send you the data. It is astonishing. No, I mean, honestly, having come from the world of biodemography and messing around with plant senescence, this is where it's at. Okay, So obviously, I mean, I think one of the things that's come through here is that human demography really matters, changing births really matter, right? And so just to give you a sense of why that might matter in a particularly implied context, one of the pathogens I work on the most is Rubella. So exactly the same as measles, directly transmitted, you have to meet someone who has Rubella, completely immunizing, but entirely unlike measles, it's very mild in children. Measles can have a case fatality rate of 20%, so it really kills kids. So you might think, well, why are we vaccinating against this pathogen? It turns out that mothers infected during pregnancy, the first trimester of pregnancy, can give birth to a child with congenital Rubella syndrome. And that's deafness, blindness, it's very tragic. It's a sort of rather complex set of outcomes that's hard to instantly diagnose, and we don't have good senses of the burdens, and quite often we back them out from these sorts of models. But the key sort of outcome here is that because we know, I showed you, that the average age of infection is shaped by, as it were, vaccination or birth rate, people have not introduced the vaccine into many parts of the world, right? Because you can imagine, if you put vaccination coverage on the x-axis here, age on the y-axis, we have this analytical result which tells us that as coverage goes up, age goes up. Intuitively, you start vaccinating, you make the infection rarer, right? So if you're not vaccinating, kids tend to get infected around age 9. You vaccinate, you make the infection rare, it takes them many more years before they encounter another individual with Rubella, they become sick. And what we're worried about, of course, is moving those ages up into where women are actually having children. If everybody's getting it at age 9, we don't care. So, and of course vaccination coverage is kind of equivalent within these models to the birth rates. It's the opposite, rather, to the birth rates. If vaccination coverage goes up, that's equivalent to birth rates falling. And, yeah, so it's just depleting the source sector.
Does the number of people who get the infection at age, say, 30 go up? I mean, the mean is conditional on people getting the disease.
So you're pushing down the incidence, absolutely, in the total population, but you're pushing up the incidence in the one age class that matters.
It does actually go up?
The actual, yeah. So you have to be doing a pretty terrible job of vaccinating to have that happen. So some of originally what happened was that there was a paper by this chap called Knox in the 60s, which suggested this was a problem based on these theoretical models. And so vaccination has not yet been introduced into most of Africa, India, a few other places. Right? Because of these theoretical concerns, I think it's one of the only places where theory has really shaped policy in an extraordinary way. I mean, I'm sure there are others, but you know what I mean. This is pretty global. But so one of the things I did was revisit those models, and you can actually show that you have to have pretty bad vaccination coverage to get into trouble. But it does also depend on what your birth rate is, you can sort of factor in those various components. And one of the things I've been grappling with is thinking about, we're trying to make the case as to whether Rubella-containing vaccines should be introduced into all these countries. And it's a very it's a very timely question because huge efforts are currently underway to control measles. So large campaigns for measles, large reinforcement of routine vaccination for measles, and the Rubella vaccine could be introduced into the measles program, so you can combine the vaccine. So by not introducing Rubella, you're kind of missing the window on these ginormous efforts. And it's possible that it's a kind of, it's a wasted opportunity, which is why WHO asked me to go back in and think about it. And one of the things I've been grappling with thinking about is, of course, this was a movie, imagine birth rates cascading down, is that we know birth rates are falling, and the simple model tells us that that should change the average age of infection, that might change the burden. So there might be a more urgent case for introducing the vaccine than would occur to you if you were just considering static birth rates. And you can just sort of simply run out what the different predictions would be, and you might get an increase in the average age of up to 5 years over this time course. But is that true? I mean, does that really match reality? This is where Ron's skepticism is perhaps not misplaced. One of the things we know is that those simple models assume that everyone is well mixed. Everybody's talking to everyone else at the same rate. And that we just know that's not true. And in particular, we know that people talk to people of different ages, so these are different age groups, at different rates. People have done a number of diary studies and shown that babies talk to babies and kids talk to kids. And then when you're like 20, 25, you start talking to babies again. Depending on the country. This is highly replicable. So the way they've got at this data is by running diary studies. and asking people to sort of write down who you talk to and at what age. And obviously this is going to move things around. Our simple results for the average age of infection are no longer going to hold. And you can explore that really simply by plugging in different variants of this matrix and seeing what that would do to the average age of infection under different vaccination regimes, under different falling birth rates. And the rather disappointing answer is a lot of things can happen, right? And so you might think, well, that's okay, you know what the contact matrix is. But you don't really, right? So we can get a diary study and get people to tell us who they talk to, but we don't know if those are disease-relevant contacts. I don't know what it takes for me to give Josh Rubella. So it's a bit of a sort of challenge at the moment, figuring out how to get to grips with this, but I'm really excited. I think we're going to get some data from China and some data from Japan, which have had these tremendous changes in birth rates, and they have really quite long records. We might be able to start exploring whether we see the patterns of age change that we expect, whether they're highly discrepant, whether we can actually start making some inference there. I thought I'd have that data today, but I don't, unfortunately. So we'll move on. And so the other demographic aspect I think about a certain amount is changing mobility, right? And so just to remind you, and so the funny thing about these directly transmissible infections is that they're kind of a readout of our behavior as well, right? Because the only way you get rubella is if someone does that to you. So you have to be quite close, right? And we have these long time series that tell us how these disease incidence numbers are changing through time. And you can imagine how you can do a really simple thing where you know how many susceptible individuals there were, say 6. You know how many infected individuals there were this week, say 1. And the next week there might be 2 new infected individuals. So you could figure out what that transmission parameter was. This is really wonderfully simple maths. Right? So here it'd be about 1/3. That transmission probability going from 1 infected individual to these susceptibles would be about 1/3. And you can imagine that you can actually, we have years and years of data. That's the other glory of working on infectious diseases instead of trees. We have like 40 years of data. And so we have repeated instances of every January, say, for example. And everybody behaves fairly seasonally, right? So we can actually get to grips with how these seasonal movement patterns are shaking out. And these turn out to be really important for the dynamics. And you might be thinking, I don't live seasonally, but term just started in Princeton, I no longer go to the same coffee shop. So I think we all move seasonally. And where this has been done, so this is an example from England and Wales. So moving from January to December, an estimate of this parameter, the transmission parameter. And this is in Niger. And in England and Wales, what you find, so that's from that same time series, is that transmission is low. So it's a very phenomenological readout of all the stuff that's going on, all the human behavior that lies under the hood. But what you find is that if the transmission is kind of sort of high here and then really low this period and then kind of comes up again, and that maps on really nicely to the school holidays, which is shown by these dips here. So you see the Easter holiday, you see the summer holiday. So we don't know for sure, but the pattern certainly suggests that the process is kids going in and out of school, which matches the average age of infection, right? If you do the same exercise in Niger, what you find is not so much a detailed school term time pattern, but more of a pattern which seems to be the opposite of what you see in terms of rainfall. And this lines up with sort of what we know a little bit about human movement in Niger. L'exode happens and up to 1/3 of the population shifts into the cities after the end of the agricultural season, and that's when the measles outbreak happens. That's when the transmission is happening. So we can sort of read into our own behavior through the lens of these infectious diseases, which I think is quite fun. There's another way we can do it. So this was just thinking about human aggregation. Another aspect is, of course, pathogen extinction. So imagine you live in your city, there's an outbreak of rubella and then it goes extinct. And then if it takes a really long time before another outbreak, then you know that you're probably, the arrival of infected individuals is quite rare, suggesting that you're in quite a remote location. People aren't turning up all the time with rubella. Whereas if, there was a really short interval, people turn up really soon with infection, that suggests that you're actually quite connected. So in these periods, in these gaps, these disease-free periods, we can read out a sense of how connected any location is to the rest of the country or whatever frame we're thinking of. And you can frame that as a hazard, and we know a lot of the underlying biology, so you need to account for how transmission is fluctuating and how susceptibles are fluctuating. You can essentially estimate a connectivity parameter for every location just by framing this, the risk of the end of the fade out, as a hazard. And if you do that, you get a connectivity parameter for every location. So I did it for Peru, people have done it for England and Wales, for all sorts of places. And you find for every city or every unit where you have data, you have a connectivity parameter. And so, for example, in Peru, the red points are points that were more connected than the average, and the blue were less connected than the average. And rather reassuringly, Lima is more connected than the average. And most of the red points are on kind of road hubs, and most of the blue points are kind of up in the mountains or not on big roads. So, and we, if you like play around with regressions, it turns out that city size really matters. Go on, Kim.
But this connectivity is a single aggregated connectivity for a place. It's not a connectivity between places at this stage.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's partly a data limitation, and you can also extend that. I'm going to mention that in a second. Yeah, and so our inference from this, which is not very powerful probably to mention in front of a bunch of sociologists, is that people go to big places. And you can reframe it. As Ken pointed out, of course you can reframe it. You can reframe it where the size of each city matters and the distance between them, and you start playing around with who those infecteds are, exactly. By
CIJ?
Some sort of connectivity parameter. So this would be the size of population J, size of population I, the distance between them, some scaling parameter. Again, plug it into some hazard that shapes all the linkages between places, or those periods of extinction, and you can get an estimate. And again, we're often, so I in particular, with my choice of pathogen, am very limited in this area because my pathogen can be so mild as to be asymptomatic. So knowing that a 0 is a 0 is a bit of a stretch. But for measles, it's worked quite well, and people have found mostly a signature of city size, but you're less likely to go between cities that are very far apart, as you might expect. So it's sort of parametric and sort of, limited in where you can go with it, because you're limited by the data, but I think it's quite interesting. So from the perspective of the infection, we get the sense that we can say something about how fluctuations in transmission can tell us something about how human populations are aggregating, and something about how human populations are moving between locations. But of course we'd like to go further. And when thinking about infectious diseases, we often sort of lay out this particular graph, which is spatial scale on the x-axis and distance on the y-axis. And these are the different types of infections you might be interested in, types of infectious disease dynamics that you might be interested in. So, daily connections in a neighborhood might lead to exposure or school, or details are spread through the classrooms. In the middle, you might be thinking about metapopulation dynamics, and all the way up to global spread on the right, or respread of particular strains. And this is essentially what, I forget who I was talking to. But, we have censuses and microcensuses for this end. We have surveys and GPS studies for the really little end. We probably have airline and shipping networks to tell us something about this. And the really exciting thing these days is we have mobile phone data and satellite imagery that can fill in a whole lot of this, which is, I think, very cool. And I stepped into this world through collaborations with Caroline Buckey, who's at Harvard. And the way it works is that she, amazingly, has convinced many, many different mobile phone operators to get her call data records. And so that means that every time someone makes a call, the tower they're closest to, the tower that the call is routed through, is recorded, right? So if this person calls here, that tower will be routed through, and if this person calls there, it'll be that tower. Okay? And since we know the locations of all the towers, we can get a sense of how that person is moving around the landscape, right? And so you can get a sense of these large fluxes of populations across the landscape. And this is an example, so showing travel in Kenya, so fluxes in populations in each of the provinces across the year. So we were focusing again on seasonal movements, and looking at transmission across the year for Rubella to see how they matched up. And it looks like, rather than the simple sort of phenomenological schools on off or maybe rainfall matters, you're actually getting at something that is relevant to disease transmission here. So that was very exciting. And the fact is, the Rubella data is always terrible. Rubella data is really frustrating. There's like 60 cases reported in Nairobi, but mobile phone data is just exquisitely detailed. So if we're confident that the mobile phone data is telling us something reasonable about the disease dynamics, we can then start going much further, and we can start thinking about risk maps for reintroduction. We know fluxes between every one of the districts in Kenya, we know timeframes, etc. And of course, mobile phone data are not perfect. There's lots of biases. But for our purposes, we've done a certain amount of evaluation to evaluate. I'm so skeptical, honestly. We've done a certain amount of investigation to make sure that we don't think it's biasing the results that we're interested in. Okay, and this has been part of one of the things that we got a Wellcome Trust Award to start really thinking about seasonal human movement by threading together all this mobile phone data, satellite imagery, and thinking in particular about climate drivers, because they're really concerned about climate change. So trying to tie it back to agricultural growing seasons, etc. So this is a very exciting thing that I'm looking forward to really moving forwards. Next. Okay, so I talked about how infectious disease could tell us about aggregation and how it could tell us about movement between places. And then I said that mobile phone data echo the aggregation patterns. Can they tell us about mobility? This is a picture of Pakistan and movement between all the different tehsils in Pakistan. And we found, that result that I was touting from the perspective of the infectious disease, people move between big places, but there is a little bit of an effect of distance. We find no decay in travel with increasing distance, so people are moving really long distances at this axis of Pakistan. And so one of the things, this is very much work that's in development, but one of the things that we're trying to do is tie this back to the measles data that we have for Pakistan. And the reason it's interesting is that Pakistan has actually been extremely successful at controlling measles. This is vaccination coverage, and this is the reported cases, so we're falling down to very low levels. And then they had a ginormous outbreak, the way countries often do, in 2012 and 2013. So they have province-level cases, and they have outbreak reports at the district scale. And the trouble is the data is just, it's kind of good, but it's not actually that good. So this is very much us battling with what to do to make this, to see whether the degree to which mobile phone data might actually be useful in this context. And so one of the things we've done is compared the top travel destinations from a particular tehsil to the top travel destinations from like a classic gravity model, which people do use a lot in our field, even though there's many reasons to think they might not be very sensible. And look at where the cases were in. So if this is your focal district, which has its outbreak kicking off around here, where do you see the next cases in terms of neighbours as measured by the mobile phone data, so the sort of most connected locations, or neighbours by a gravity model? And maybe the mobile phone data does a little bit better at getting there early, but it's not clear. This is something I'm still wrestling with. And it's possible that the measles data is just not really good enough.
So the goal here is to...
We'd really like to
get a 2-week ahead notice.
Yeah, and that would be the magic. But we would need to ground it in the measles data, and I'm concerned that the measles data is just not good enough. Because the way they only report outbreaks. So when you're in alert, you're reporting that there might be background cases going on, so you're not sure you're actually capturing a new introduction. But every year, all the literature suggests that if you can get a 2-week jump, or even a month jump on a measles outbreak, that does considerably reduce, reactive vaccination can considerably reduce cases and burden.
I don't really want to think about this right, but is there a way to flip these two pieces of data around? It seemed like in the beginning you were saying we can learn interesting things about the isolation and mobility of populations from outbreak data. Now you sort of got the cell phone data, which is very much about interchange of people. Can you tell us, now maybe we can't get cell phone data for every place. Maybe it's quite limited. Maybe can you use the cell phone data to validate the inferences from the disease outbreak about mobility and isolation, so that we could then, if we have more disease data for places where we don't have cell phone data, we could say with confidence, yes, that is an isolated population based on these disease patterns.
That's a wonderful suggestion. I think that's one of the things we'd really like to do. The problem is we have this real jigsaw puzzle where we have disease data here and mobile phone data there.
Do you have mobile phone data for Peru?
No. We have mobile phone data from very surprising places, but Peru is not one of them. I mean, I'm amazed that Pakistan gave us all the data. Anyway, so the other really interesting place where you could sort of tie together, I think, data and theory here is, we are talking about what an ecologist would call a metapopulation, right? All these linked patches. And within each of these patches, we're getting this sort of, this oscillating behavior, right? These outbreaks that are happening at more or less the same time of year in the two patches, right? And so they're going to have peaks sort of at the same time of year, probably, although it will depend. And so the question then is, what's going to shape the probability of extinction at the scale of the metapopulation, not at the scale of any individual patch, but given we know how linked they are, what's going to shape the probability that the whole thing goes extinct? Measles, obviously not people. And we have data from Pakistan, we have data from Kenya, and so we're starting to think about whether we can start putting them on a plot. There's a sort of classic result where as coupling increases, you get this U-shaped relationship with the probability of extinction in the metapopulation. And that's because if places are very weakly linked, then each one can just passively go extinct solo, and there's no rescue, there's no metapopulation rescue effect. And if they're massively linked, then they might be driving each other so that their troughs are happening at the same time and their peaks are happening at the same time. So you might then also end up with a high probability of metapopulation extinction. And it's theoretical and sort of delightful to us for that reason, but I think it also has applied sides in terms of, every WHO region currently has measles elimination goals. No one thinks they're going to make it, but it is very much, one of the things they're thinking about is what context will success happen and where is the best likely to occur. So that's one of the places we're going. And I thought I'd just steal a brief interlude at the end to tell you about, how am I doing? Fantastic. To tell you about one of the things I'm really excited about doing next. And so this is really narrowing in, trying to nail down disease and motion in some context. And this is Madagascar, off the coast of Mozambique. This is the capital nestled up in the highlands. And this is in the neighborhood of Amboipu. This is the view from my bedroom window as I was growing up. That's not why I'm showing it. I think Madagascar is actually a fantastic test bed for getting to grips for so many angles on how we're shaping the movement of diseases and how that's feeding back. So I've got a lot of the data on measles and rubella, because that's what I do. And I've started looking at how transmission, estimates of transmission sort of shake out in terms of thinking about whether school terms, here shown in grey, are shaping transmission. It doesn't really look like it. Another thing we're doing is we're getting, we're looking at flu serology. Right? And so this is where if I were to go out in this room and I was to take your blood, which would be strange, I could then test it against all these circulating strains of flu. Right? I could see if you had been exposed to Hong Kong 68. I could see if you had been exposed to Bangkok 79. Right? It's a very clear signature. So amazingly, serology gives us this window back into the past. This is work from my colleague Justin Lester, who did just that in China. So these are all the different flu strains, and this is the age of the person they took the blood from. And you can see that if you're too young to really see the strain, apart from some cross-reactivity, obviously you don't react. And then you get this pattern sort of going up. And what we've done is we've got these paired samples all across Madagascar, from urban and rural sites, where we're going to pull out an age range and start looking to see the degree to which people react to Hong Kong 68. Because I don't know that we know how connected Madagascar was to the rest of the world in 68, whether the influenza virus, that was global, everybody was getting it. Were they also getting it in Madagascar? And one of the things I'm excited about is Madagascar for the longest time basically had flights to Paris, because that's the legacy of colonialism. And in 2002, a flight to Bangkok was introduced. And I wonder whether we can see a readout of that complete change in connectivity in infectious disease dynamics and in people's blood. It comes across as slightly vampiric, but it's actually, it's good. We're also looking at the mobile phone data, so we've got the two major companies, Telnow and Orange, on board to help us get at this data. And one of the questions we're really fascinated with there is Madagascar has not had malaria on the high plateau, which is really rather high, 1,000 meters, since the 80s. They had a big outbreak in the 80s, killed a lot of people, and since then they've really controlled it. It turns out mosquitoes don't move very much. The things that move malaria are people. And understanding the kind of pressure of reintroductions from all the places that do have a lot of malaria is something that's really considered an urgent public health issue, because Madagascar had a political crisis in 2009, and there's just been sort of zero investment in most aspects of health, including maintaining control of malaria. And also the final thing is, by looking at it from all these different angles, one of the things we're looking at is health system data. So this is administrative coverage, so number of doses delivered across a number of years from a health centre in the south of Madagascar, Abuvumbe. And you can see that, at least in recent years, the coverage seems to be higher at the start of the year, which is surprising, because you'd think that was exactly when travel was the hardest. But that gives us another sense of, mothers are turning out with their kids for some reason a lot more at the spring rate than at the later in the year rate. So that'll give us another sense of, another angle on starting to think about how people are moving around in this landscape and how that is shaping disease and the control of disease. So yeah, so movement across scales from, the serology to the mobile phone data, thinking about the climate drivers of this, because the Wellcome Trust wants us to, and then pulling in the different disease data as well. well as the different vaccination data from all these different sources, I think will allow us to really narrow on what's shaping disease dynamics in this context. And that's everything. I should have said I get lots of money from Bill and Melinda and from the Wellcome Trust. And all these people actually did all the work. That's something I should say. So these are some wonderful Malagasy collaborators, and these are some brilliant graduate students, and these are just the other people.
Can I go back to my question about the average age?
Yeah.
It just struck me as a strange, I understand the intuition behind why higher average age might be bad, but if I eliminate incidence at a younger age and don't change anything else, I've moved the average age up, but arguably I haven't made anything worse, I've made the world better. So wouldn't I just want to look at the infection rate of people aged 30, shouldn't that be my outcome in all these models?
So I think that you're, so absolutely, so this is a great point. And also if you're thinking about how vaccine should actually be delivered, you might be thinking, why don't we just vaccinate all girls 12 upwards, right? That'll be who you want to protect. And it turns out people don't do that because they want to deliver it via the measles programs, right? But certainly when I kind of crank the handle on these models, the outcome I'm interested in is the infection in those late age individuals, and in fact I have a fertility model and a probability of that turning into a CRS baby model.
And so do you come out that, that the unvaccinated parts of the world are doing the right thing by holding off until they get very good coverage, or are they just using it as an excuse because everyone's looking for an excuse not to spend money?
It's actually terrifying how much people want to introduce the Rubella vaccine. It's like people think that everyone's bored of measles, so let's throw Rubella in there to kind of jazz it up. People worry about donor fatigue. So when I came into this, and I was, a fairly sort of nervous junior postdoc, and I had to go present to WHO, and it was so stressful. And the, so I worry a lot about exactly how you frame it, right? Because you could say, it would be bad to, or it would be good unless. It would be bad unless, or it would be good unless, are two ways to present your results. The crux of the matter is, if your birth rate is really high, your coverage needs to be equivalently high. So Somalia should not introduce Rubella-containing vaccine. Ghana probably can. A lot more in Africa, a lot more of the countries in Africa probably can. However, that said, this is the outcome of, models using the best data we could get to grips with. And one of the big unknowns is what is our norms for Rubella in these different settings? And that changes the answer, right? And it's been estimated to be as high as 12 in Addis Ababa, but the average is 5. So if it's as high as 12, suddenly you're in a much more dicey situation, but data from lots of different places put it much lower. So, one of the things we did was we created we tried to create something that gave you a sense of your risk of introducing the vaccine, given the distribution that we inferred for our norms, so as to get at that uncertainty. And most places are in the green area of that chart, but a few places like Somalia are in the red. And then WHO just ignored them.
Well, one of the, and this is related to the same question about average age, and we were talking about behavioral things. One of the other things, could you manipulate the infection rate by mixing the people, by encouraging more movement or more contact?
So sort of having chickenpox parties.
Basically, yeah, I was thinking about that. Yeah.
I think that doing that in an equitable and complete fashion would probably be harder than vaccinating in an equitable and complete fashion, right?
But you could do both.
But I don't know.
But you could do both.
You could do both. You could do both. Yeah. So
it's not one or the other. It's like you're doing both.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is above my pay grade. But absolutely, you're right. If you're confident that the child had Rubella, that you had a child who hadn't had Rubella, you might want to mix them together. But any Rubella circulating, means that pregnant women are at risk. So it's a funny thing to. Japan just ran out of Rubella-containing vaccine and had a big outbreak, and they just used it to vaccinate anyone who ever came in contact with. If you identified yourself as a pregnant woman, they just got everyone around you. So yeah, if you could guarantee that the kids would get together, that the kids would both get sick, and that they would never meet a pregnant woman, then okay. I think. Okay.
So, as you know, I'm a great enthusiast in this kind of work, and it does seem resent the way that big data, biology, and demography are coming together in your paper, a recent paper, and in a lot of work that other people are doing, the mobile phone data have become a great source now for measuring total mobility of a certain, somewhat ill-defined subgroup of the population using mobile phones. Those movements are like one variable that goes into the predictive side of the equation for many outcomes, not only rubella, measles, influenza, common colds, and a host of other infections that are principally spread by contact, although not always confined to human hosts and common in Africa, especially. And so one might ask for the next stage of research whether it might be a consortium effort in which the single set of predictor variables are then modulated by the different effects of the different pathogens that have their own different pathogen life histories, and therefore the different response rates are likely to tease out different components of that mobility. So clearly people mostly, it's a big deal to work on one disease or two diseases. You have an awful lot to learn in each time, but the possibility for consortium work would seem to allow for large-scale models that might get more refined information. Is this where the field is likely to go, or are the boundaries on disease specialties so strong that it's hard to combine?
So one of the really exciting things for me about this Wellcome Trust grant is that Caroline Buckley, my counterpart at Harvard, and she's also British, so works on cholera and malaria, and I work on measles and rubella. And you know, one of the things we're really trying to do is to bring together multiple disease time series. So we have a ton of data from Thailand on 15 different diseases, and do exactly what you suggested. So pull together the mobility data, explore theoretically what we'd expect outcomes to be, given what we know of the life cycle of pathogens, and then tie it back to the data where there is data. You know, there isn't always data, that's the frustrating thing. Often the missing pieces of the pathogen data. But absolutely, I think that's a great idea. And you know, like, what you don't understand, what doesn't make sense if you're just looking through the lens of rubella, I think when you have rubella and cholera and malaria, will suddenly start to be, all the different threads will inform each other as well. That's the dream.
Well, it's a dream, but it's not a dream for 50 years from now. Sounds like it's a dream for next year, or the year after.
You know, the infectious disease community is actually really quite an open one. So data does get shared around, and it is quite a collaborative community in many ways. So that's been delightful as well. And you know, people make their data freely available because you know, there's people just. All of Mexico's infectious disease data is up freely available online for the last 20 years or something. People, data is just floating around as well. Yeah.
So I wonder more about sort of this notion of using the disease data to model dynamics of mobility, and perhaps this element that it is not available. But sociologists spend a lot of time in Demography thinking about segregation of populations, racial segregation of populations, and generally that ends up being residential segregation, because that's what's measurable. And through some work with cell phones, measuring the sort of integration of everyday life, but I wonder if there are disease pattern data by race or some other relevant language group, wherever you are in the world, you know, can you speak to sort of a broader measure of segregation as picked up on these patterns, as in you see the disease is confined to certain groups and not jumping groups, and that tells us something about the interaction of social groups?
So that's a great question. There's a wonderful quote, I'm now blanking on who said it, but someone once said, measles is like love, everyone gets it. And that's true, because it's just so transmissible, it tears through, it does, you know, you have to be really segregated for that to matter. And so that, you know, these are the diseases I know most about. There are suggestions, for example, you know, a higher average age of infection suggests that you're not having as much exposure, and of course that's a concern for rubella. And there has been suggestions that nomadic groups or remote communities are less connected. I don't know that we've ever seen it in a city.
Yeah.
Because, you know, these are childhood infections. These are actually amongst the most transmissible. Of course, things like cholera, where your sewage system really matters, you get tremendous heterogeneity, but that's, I think, less to do with segregation than poor infrastructure.
So there's, in other words, there's enough integration of groups that
we get
infectious diseases. We know there's highly segregated schools, right? Where
I'm
you
sure,
know, white
I'm
kids
sure
don't go to school with black kids, but yet.
I'm sure there is a disease where that's not the case, but
No,
the ones I
maybe
work
it tells us
on
something.
are massively transmissible. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the, yeah.
Maybe
yeah.
the answer.
Right, sexually transmitted disease.
Yes, that would be the one.
Other questions? We have 20 papers here, so we have lots of targets for questions.
Targets.
So, going different direction, there's a sociology of different kinds of social connectedness, and the mobile phone data are very general. These areas in terms of age and group coverage in areas where there aren't landlines, but there are also now with smartphones or semi-smartphones, you have Twitter data that come out in large amounts. You have Facebook connectivity. You have the airline connectivity data. You have the train and bus route connectivity data. And so one sees papers again separated by who's using which big data set, reflecting people who are moving. And one could imagine in another direction trying to distinguish different age groups and different ethnic or socioeconomic groups, again by the signatures of the different motions in these different media that are in use. Again, hard enough to handle 200 million mobile phone connections, not to say take 5 or 6 200 million connection data sets and merge them. But to what extent do you see that as a direction, trying to get demographically definable subgroups out of the profiles of different media use?
So that's that is the frustrating thing about the mobile phone data. You just know where people are. But we have, some operators have suggested that they might be able to give us, different aggregates if we were to frame the question quite carefully and work with them, right? Because they don't necessarily have the time or energy to be manipulating these huge data files. So Amy Wozniacki, who's on this list, is my data guru. And so she'll go and sit with the operators and work with them to sort of pull out what we're interested in. And certainly, any, we love data, right? any ways in which you could achieve that, I think would be fantastic. I haven't thought so much about the signatures of demography in Twitter and how that might cost me, but it's certainly, you have Dennis to do that for you, don't you? But yeah, that's an exciting direction.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Very exciting.